given the limited time we have, our conversation today will be to talk a little about Confucius. Obviously, in 50 minutes, we cannot cover everything, but we can discuss some of the main aspects of his philosophy. Confucius, in fact, is a topic that is not just beginning to gain attention. For several years now, his teachings have been emerging and, so to speak, coming in as a trend. If it is even possible to say that a philosopher who lived in 551 BC, one could say that he has become fashionable. But, in fact, there is a dynamic in our current world. When a people rise economically, everything related to them also rises along with them. So today, it has become fashionable to talk about Confucius. In fact, there are even those little exercises comparing the thoughts of philosophers to business management. Countless things of this sort have been done. Because, in truth, China has drawn a great deal of attention and has brought its values along with it. But we can say that today, China is not very Confucian at all. Perhaps now this is changing, especially as China seeks to win over others. In shaping its image for the international public, Confucius becomes an excellent ambassador for these values. But until very recently, just 10 or 15 years ago, Confucius was very rarely taught in schools under the current political regime in China. And now, this is beginning to return once again. So then, our focus today, which is Confucius, is a figure who has had a profound impact on the West. You will see, he is introduced. Curiously, he is brought to the West by the Jesuits around the 17th century. We will discuss this, as the Jesuits themselves recognized that, in what they had observed about the works and ideas of Confucius, he was much more aligned with a moral philosophy than with a religion. Therefore, it did not compete in any way with the Christianity that prevailed at that time, and which still prevails in the West today. So, they brought Confucius philosophy to the West without major issues. It truly possesses this characteristic. Confucius is not particularly inclined toward metaphysics. On the contrary, he refuses to speak about it. You will not see Confucius speaking about life after death or the existence of the soul. He speaks about life. And whenever he is asked, he always gives the same answer. First, understand life before you set out to understand death. First, understand humanity before you set out to understand the gods. He believed that each person has a focus, which is the sphere of action where they are right now, and that one must strive to live it in the best way possible. And his concepts are truly beautiful. Let us see if we can understand them a little, and even break certain stigmas that have formed in the Western mindset, such as the idea of rigidity, the idea of inflexibility. And we will see that one thing he definitely was not, was rigid, dogmatic, or inflexible. Quite the opposite, in fact. He had a deep appreciation for intelligence and flexibility in his disciples. He greatly valued this quality. So, very briefly, because we cannot dwell too long on this, right? We know that he lived during a very turbulent political era, and that he traveled throughout the China of his time, across various kingdoms and states, striving to spread his ideas. He even faced an attempt on his life. There were those who tried to kill Confucius. It was a remarkable time, and he would say, well, that which I am, no one can take from me. What I am comes from the decrees of heaven, and nothing of the earth can change that. Could ever be taken from me. But both he and his disciples faced attempts on their lives. His philosophy was considered subversive, even though his thought was purely philosophical and moral. It was not connected to any theology or religious doctrine whatsoever. Yet, in a China divided into many deeply corrupted states, virtue itself was seen as subversive. In fact, this is a timeless principle. Whenever we live through periods of great corruption, virtue becomes an act of subversion. And he experiences this very intensely. Well, continuing on. It is said that his origins were noble, but he himself went through great hardships. He recounts this himself. In his childhood and youth, he lived a very modest life. It seems that his family had to flee from another kingdom. He was born in Lu, around the year of 551 BCE. And in this kingdom, he already lived a very humble existence. It is very important for you to take into consideration that there is a biography of Confucius by Sima Qian, but it was written almost 4 centuries after his death. By then, Confucius was already regarded as an iconic figure in China. So, there was already a tendency to embellish his story. Most of what we have about the biography of Confucius is more fantasy than grounded in real facts. In fact, almost nothing is truly known, almost nothing at all. Stories such as him being the 11th sibling, or that his mother was 15 years old when she married, these are all assumptions made by Sima Qian. What is known is what he himself says, and what Mencius says shortly after, that he had a modest childhood and youth. That much is certain. And that, let's say, his existence was not an easy one. At no point in his life. He never enjoyed great material comforts, nor was he truly well understood by those around him. Well, it is said that, at 17, this was the case. As a child, something he himself mentions, he greatly enjoyed being in the company of men who possessed either age, wisdom, or, ideally, both. They always had something to teach him. How beautiful it is when Confucius says that the greatest hallmark of his life is an unwavering will to learn. He was a true lover of learning, and he believed that as long as there was life, he would continue learning. It is truly, truly beautiful when he says this, "Look, nothing distinguishes me more than this." And it seems that he was like this since he was a boy, almost a pre-adolescent, always seeking the company of those who had something to teach him. So much so that, by the time he was 17, he was already hired by Prince Tilu and began to serve as a public official. By the age of 20, he was already considered an intellectual, so to speak, since the concept did not exist then as it does today. An intellect detached from life, purely theoretical, did not exist. But he was already regarded as a person of extraordinary culture. At just 20 years old, he displayed all the traits of genius from a very young age. This is something that is often said, but it is also very much a part of the collective imagination. No one can say for certain if this was real. Did Confucius ever meet Laozi? Sima Qian says yes. But there is no contemporary testimony to confirm this. He tells the story and even describes the dialogue. It is difficult for us to know for sure. Where could he have obtained such precise information? It would be quite fascinating if it had happened, because they are two great men. From a historical perspective, it would be truly sensational. It is as if, in the West, you imagined, I don't know, Jesus meeting Muhammad. For China, it is equivalent to that, as they are two founders of religions, two beings of tremendous greatness, and extremely important figures in the history of humanity. And, according to what is said, according to Sima Qian's account, he would have gone to the banks of the Yellow River to meet Laozi. And Laozi, for those who have read the Tao Te Ching, which is one of my passions, I love this book. Laozi was tremendously abstract. He works with the idea that you should not waste time on things that are fleeting, on things that are, so to speak, untranscendent, on things that are not spiritual. Because all of this dissipates, all of this is dust, and, as the Christian tradition says, to dust shall return. In other words, it is not worth it for a person to waste time on anything that is material. And Confucius is the opposite, because he does not worry about whether something is dust or not. He is concerned with one thing: we are here now, and we must strive to do well whatever we are doing now. What comes next, we will deal with when it arrives. According to this historian, Sima Qian, Confucius is said to have returned saying something similar to having encountered a man who flew so high that he resembled a strog-flight bird, and that he preferred to walk upon the earth. Which is, more or less, they are not in contradiction at all, but when you read both, you notice this. Confucius never takes his feet off the ground. He speaks of a moral, practical, and experiential philosophy, attainable by any human being who is willing to pursue it now. Whereas Laozi was not quite like that. Laozi spoke of a man who had exhausted material reality and was seeking something more. Contemporary. In other words, it is not impossible. But it has not been proven either. Such an encounter would be something truly spectacular. But there is no evidence. Well, then, the central lesson of Confucianism is basically this, that the spiritual person does not have to lead a life of skepticism, because union with the higher can be achieved and maintained in the midst of earthly life, since the obstacles to this union are not outside, but within us. You do not need to isolate yourself, nor do you need any special condition to reach a higher level of consciousness, to discover your human nature. Because the obstacles to this are not outside of you, they are within. Whether you are on top of a mountain, on the banks of a secluded river, or in a desert, you will face the same challenges. They are simply less projected outward. Not outside, but within. But the same factors that you must overcome to become a gentleman, a perfect human being, what he calls a Jew man. You will encounter them wherever you may be. Wherever you go, you will carry these obstacles with you, because they are within you. Therefore, he did not advocate asceticism. He spoke of the life of a person within society, committed to the community. One of Confucius' strongest concerns was fraternity, the life in society. He is renowned for establishing a school that, in the context of the East, closely resembles Plato's academy. After traveling throughout the world, he returned to the state of Lu and founded a school with a select group of disciples. Well, education, even today, remains somewhat restrictive. In our times, and even more so back then, access to education was extremely limited. Very few people had the opportunity to receive an education, and the criteria, of course, were economic, relatives of princes, authorities within the state. But Confucius selected his disciples based on a completely different criterion. He chose those who already demonstrated a certain level of intelligence, imagination, and a basic moral foundation. This approach is very similar to what Plato practiced in his academy. He formed a select group of disciples and imparted his teachings to them. He himself, as you know, never wrote anything down. Everything that was collected and later became the Analects, the book most authentically attributed to him, comes from his followers. There are 2 other books attributed to him, but their authorship is debatable. The Analects are entirely a compilation made by his disciples. He himself did not write anything. At one point, before he began his travels, and to what extent this is folklore, no one can say for sure, he held a very important position within the state of Lu. It was equivalent to being a minister of justice. He was the head of the police powers, and it is said that he was extremely just, as one would expect. But then it is said that the neighboring state, which was an enemy of Lu, presented the Prince of Lu with a group of several beautiful dancers. And this corrupted the prince, and the prince stopped listening to him, and he ceased to prioritize public life. And he, deeply disheartened by this, he decided to withdraw from the kingdom. Mencius says that he may have withdrawn for another reason, that he left because he was not remembered. He was extremely attentive to the rites, especially those sacrifices owed to the state. Whatever the reason, something happened. He became discouraged, gathered his disciples, and set out to travel the world, sharing his teachings. This story about the dancers is also somewhat folkloric. It cannot be said for certain whether it actually happened or not. He would then travel through the kingdoms, seeking princes and rulers who were willing to listen to him, because one of the things he most wanted to teach was how to govern people, how to lead people well. But he also taught anyone who was willing to listen. This was also something quite unusual, because it broke with the entire hierarchical order. At that time, teaching and education were considered luxuries, and they were not offered to just anyone who wished to learn. He traveled throughout the world, as I mentioned to you. He faced attacks, and even his disciples were targeted. His most beloved disciple, Yen, nearly died in an ambush. He says that those who learned from him always wanted him to stay. He used to say this: "I am indiscriminately indebted to all people, because I consider everyone who inhabits the earth as members of the same family, within which I have the sacred mission of being an instructor." He had a sense that he had come to earth to humanize people, that he had come into the world to humanize others, and that he owed this to everyone who wished to listen to him. The way he expresses himself is very beautiful, and very prudent. He is a man who combines several difficult virtues. He is tremendously intelligent, insightful, yet prudent. When asked what wisdom is, he reflects deeply. Do you know what wisdom is? It is to know the soul of man in depth, to understand how to relate to him and, if necessary, to know how to guide him. He had a profound understanding of the human soul. It is interesting to note that he lived to an advanced age for his historical period. And he lived precisely because he possessed diplomacy, an ability to interact with people, to never say more than what people could bear to hear, which was truly extraordinary. He employed an entire political strategy, a highly refined diplomacy. Soon, we will explore this aspect in greater detail. He passed away at the age of 73 in the state of Lu. He died in the same place where he was born. Today, there is a tomb there that was most likely built long after his death. Because when he died, evidently, he did not have the recognition that he would come to have 2 centuries later. But there, in what is now the region of the state of Lu, a tomb was built, and he is considered one of the most important figures in the history of China. Certainly, if not the most important, I believe that only Laozi could be considered to rival Confucius in significance. Only Laozi would be worthy of being regarded as equally important. As I mentioned to you, he was a reformer. And he based his reform on these 2 concepts, justice and fraternity. Confucius was so bold that he created an entire hierarchy of what it means to be human, what the destiny of humanity is, and how far one could aspire to go. First of all, there was the sage, and he would ask, "Do you know who is a sage?" "No one, not even myself. I don't know anyone who is. But one day, some human being will reach that level." Of course, he was modest. I believe he truly was a sage. But he would say, "The sage is such a perfect person that it is difficult to find one." Next, you will see a complete man. Then, further down, you will find a gentleman, or a Jew man. This gentleman, or Jew man, was the ideal he proposed and spoke about. This is attainable, it is something that can be reached. And it is for this purpose that I want to educate you. He would go on to describe, in detail, all the behaviors of a Jew man. If you want to know what a perfect man would be for Confucius, this is very illustrative. I always recommend this to my disciples. Because when you read a sage of this stature speaking about what it means to be a complete person, you can dare to imagine yourself in that place, reaching that someday. Because one of the greatest powers that human beings possess, my friends, is imagination. If you do not imagine yourself, the collective unconscious will imagine you and will implant that image within you. And before you even realize it, you will be moving toward it. If you do not dare to build within yourself, through a conscious act of will, where you want to go and truly believe in it, rest assured that society will impose a model upon you. And you, without even noticing, will find yourself imagining that you are the hero of the primetime soap opera. A model will slip in between the lines of your inattention. A person either chooses what they want to be, or they will be chosen. And it is rare to find a wise person who speaks so descriptively about what an ideal human being is, as Confucius does, in every detail. The path, the Tao, and its virtue, Te. Look at how beautiful these phrases are. He has not lived in vain, the one who dies on the day he discovered the path. I discovered the path today. If I die today, it was already worth it. A single day in which I saw the path already justifies a lifetime. I devote my heart to the path. I ground myself in virtue. I trust, in benevolence, for support. They understand through the arts. This was truly his life. He was a great appreciator of the arts. Now, let us try to understand a bit about this story of the path, the Tao, and the Te. These were concepts that predated him by far. Laozi himself worked with this in the Tao Te Ching. The Tao, or the path, is very a similar concept to the Eastern idea of Dharma. Can you see? This idea is very helpful to us. It is a law that binds all beings together and leads them toward their destiny. In fact, India has a concept that I find beautiful, which is the idea of the Satratma, a thread. They say that it passes through every being in the universe, as if all beings were beads on a necklace. This thread runs through each one of them, guiding them toward unity, toward their ideal, toward the destiny that is uniquely theirs. There is a very beautiful passage by a 19th century philosopher, Helena Blavatsky. She says something I find very interesting on how she defines dynamic eternity, which closely resembles this concept from Confucius. In fact, she often cites Confucius and conducted extensive comparative studies. She says the following: dynamic eternity is like this. Look at the sky, look at the stars, imagine the amount of life that must be spread throughout the vast reaches of the universe, so immense in this way. And she says, look, I don't know what forms of life might exist in the four corners of the universe. I don't know what language they speak, I don't know how they communicate, or what form they have. But one thing I do know, there must be messengers there, transmitting a message. I don't know with what words, but I know what they are saying. Throughout the four corners of the universe, a single message echoes, calling all children back to the Father's house, calling all beings back to unity. I don't know what language they speak, but I know what they are saying. There is a call throughout the four corners of the universe, calling humanity back to the path, to the Tao. Now, how does this message, this Dharma, this Sutratma manifest itself in the universe? It is through the Te, which is its shadow, its virtue. So, the way it manifests today is different, for example, from how it manifested in Egypt. Because people today have a different psyche, a different way of seeing the world. They have other needs, and they also have other weaknesses. Therefore, the Te, which is the shadow of the Tao in the world, will have to adapt. Adapt to the possibilities for humanity's understanding at that moment. So, it is as if it were the Dharma and its shadow in the world. A timeless and temporal ethics, that is, the inexorable law, which has a unique destiny, leads beings back to unity, leads the children back home. And its shadow, which is the Te. And this shadow of the Te, when it manifests in the world, will give rise to something else, a concept that he cherishes deeply, which is the right. Right, for Confucius, remember, Confucius is not, although a religion was later created in his name, his interest was not religious. His interest was in a practical, lived ethics that would humanize people. For him, the right was anything you did in an attempt to embody the way in the world. It was an effort to build a bridge between heaven and earth. In other words, all of human life was sacred. This is very similar to the concept of religion, even though he himself was not religious. Religare, religio, to reread, to reunite two worlds that had been separated. So, we will see that this is how he speaks about the way. All the time, he speaks about the way. When his disciples receive invitations to participate in the state, because many of them were very wise, they are invited to take up positions within the states. He tells them, look, never work for a state that does not follow the way. Never be motivated solely by material gain or by fame. Never profane your wisdom by working for someone who is not in service to the way. The just man works for the way. And his entire life was dedicated to working for this way. Heaven and the mandate of heaven. This concept is also very beautiful. Heaven, Tian, and the mandate of heaven, Tian Ming. And look at the phrases he says. Heaven is the author of the virtue that exists within me. When they try to kill him, it is said that he utters this phrase. So-and-so could not kill me, because what would he be killing in me? The virtue? Heaven is the owner of the virtue that exists within me. Who could go against heaven? For him, the decrees of heaven are this law, which is the Dharma, distilled into moral maxims. For example, duty, being just, duty, being fraternal, duty, respecting the wisdom one possesses, duty, being consistent with the words one speaks. These are decrees of heaven that humans could not dispute. And deviations from the decrees of heaven will bring about corrections from heaven. It is more or less like the idea of dharma and karma. Do you understand? He will say that, at times, things happen to people that cannot be avoided. Because these are corrections, they are the interventions of heaven when, at a certain moment, the decrees of heaven are not fulfilled. So, for him, at all times, a person must learn to speak the language of the decrees of heaven. And the person who lives in this way, who brings the decrees of heaven into the world, is someone who lives a sacred life, who lives the ritual. And then he will speak a little about this matter. This phrase I selected for you is part of a larger passage, which we will see at the end, and it is beautiful. He speaks about the moments of his own life. He says that, at the age of 50, he understood the decrees of heaven. Imagine that, I am already over 50 years old and I still have not understood anything about the decrees of heaven. At 50, he says, he understood the laws of the universe. And as life went on, he says that, at 70, he no longer needed to make any effort, because his desires never exceeded the decrees of heaven. Imagine, not even a millimeter to the left or to the right of the decrees of heaven. A man who achieves this in his lifetime. But from a young age, he speaks of his search. His great love for learning and his ability to learn from everything and everyone. Not missing opportunities. An interesting thing within the Scandinavian tradition is that it is said Odin was the wisest god because he learned from everyone. Everywhere he went, he would ask questions and learn from everyone. Confucius holds this same principle on the other side of the world. He learned from everything and everyone, always maintaining a spirit of learning. And he considered learning to be a sacred function par excellence. Now you will see that this is interesting, because there really wasn't this notion of learning without applying it to life. When people spoke of learning, they spoke of formation. No one could imagine a person who knew a lot of things and was corrupt. That idea simply did not exist. Either you knew, or you did not know. If you knew, you lived it. You can see that this separation between these two things is a somewhat modern, contemporary concept that developed over the course of history. A knowledge that is neither deeply understood nor put to use. This would be almost incomprehensible to a philosophy from that era. For what purpose? Why go through all the effort to acquire knowledge and then not use it? It is as if you went through tremendous effort to gather money, to buy a house, and then never set foot inside it. You would not enjoy it in any way. That would be exotic and strange. Notice how interesting this is. How beautiful this part is when he speaks about the rites. A rite, then, is that moment when you apply the decrees of heaven to your own life. And in the moment when you walk along the path. I mentioned to you that, in the Greek tradition, they said that a person either trivializes life or sacralizes life. When one lives life as sacred, it is as if they are above time. They have stolen moments from Chronos for the Zeus. They have stolen moments from time for eternity. This is very similar to Confucius' idea here. He will say that the person who lives by the right makes their life perfect, and that there is no moment that could not be ritualized. In this, he recalls the concept of Kantian morality. Kant says that something that cannot be lived as sacred is a sign that you should not be living it. Do you understand this? If you cannot do something, this act that I am performing, in the name of something that is sacred to me, if this would not serve as an offering, it is a sign that you should not be doing it. And in the life of a person, everything that is necessary is entirely capable of being made sacred. That is what he is going to say. Just look, turning oneself toward the observance of rites, placing them above the individual, constitutes benevolence. Think of a virtue that is important to Confucius, and that is benevolence. Benevolence is always a positive disposition toward others. But benevolence must be joined with wisdom, because otherwise, he says that benevolence without wisdom turns into foolishness. Benevolence combined with wisdom enables a person to be beneficial to all life around them. Therefore, turning toward the observance of rituals, rising above the individual, constitutes benevolence, that is, rising above your own selfishness, your tendency to think only of yourself. Do not look unless it is in accordance with the rites. Do not listen unless it is in accordance with the rites. Do not speak unless it is in accordance with the rites. In other words, not a single word, neither to the left nor to the right. I appreciate this passage, which actually has nothing to do with Confucius. It comes from the Indian tradition, from the Ramayana, where a character one day stands before Brahma, earns the right to make a request, and asks that his will may never be even a step to the left or to the right of Dharma, which is the Indian term. This is what Confucius says as well, never, not even. Let your life not stray even a point to the left or to the right of the rights. Not in what you see, nor in what you think, nor in what you feel, nor in what you say. This is what life is. Now, you might say, but you mentioned that he was not rigid, how can it be so restrictive then? You will see that he is not rigid at all. In fact, even though he never claims to be wise, at the level he had attained, he often allowed himself the right to create a new right, one more adapted to the historical moment in which he lived. And he considered that the previous right was no longer appropriate. He says, if there is no intelligence, there is no possibility of living the right. There is only rigidity. He reconstructs the right, guided by common sense and discernment. And he recognizes this as a necessity. When there are no longer men capable of interpreting the decrees of heaven, heaven and earth will cease to communicate. This is Confucius, this is from the Analects. Almost all of this lecture I'm drawing from the Analects. A few small passages are from the book of Mencius. The right, li, and righteousness, e. Look at how interesting this is. He gives a description. It's something that seems quite casual in the middle of the text, but nothing in Confucius is casual. Everything has meaning. You might wonder, why is he saying this? But notice how insightful this is. The rites prescribe a ceremonial cap made of linen. Today, we use black silk instead. This is more frugal, and I follow the majority. The rites prescribe that a person should bow before ascending the steps of the temple. Today, people do this after descending. This is a casual change. And against the majority, I bow before ascending. Do you understand this? I do not wear the linen cap, the linen ceremonial hat. Why is that? Because it is much more frugal, much simpler, and much more appropriate to use the silk one. So, I reinterpret the rite, and I adapt it to something more frugal, something more virtuous. That is to say, in this regard, I follow what everyone else does. Now, when it comes to bowing before the sacred, whether before or after the staircase, there is no sense in people bowing afterward. This is a casual change. It does not obey any law of necessity, it does not obey justice, it does not obey anything. So, I prefer the rite. In other words, my discernment reconstructs the rite. Imagine, then, a person capable of rebuilding this bridge, of being a pontiff. Even though the idea of religion is not mentioned at any point, he is able to rebuild, and he says, the ancient people, the dynasties of the past, would reconstruct the rite appropriate to their time. And it is necessary that there are people like this. That is, in what aligns with virtues, I reinterpret the rite. In what does not align with virtues, I preserve the rite. And in this way, I will adapt life. And I preserve the path of heaven projected onto the earth. I preserve both the Tao and the Ti, the decrees of heaven, read in the language of today, by a person of today. I was sharing with you all that this is a very interesting thing. When we want to talk about justice, about love, and we look for a symbol, do you remember? We turn to symbols from Greece or Rome. You have to use Themis, the one holding the scales, or you have to use Aphrodite, because our society does not create its own symbols. And it also does not build a timeless ethic, adapted to a contemporary language. We have a legalistic ethic, based on Christ, which is much more connected to the interests of a particular moment than to something truly timeless. He says that this must always exist. People who interpret the decrees of heaven so they can be lived out on earth. True pontiffs. In a society without pontiffs, there is no dialogue between heaven and earth. Now, notice how interesting this is. He is speaking about his disciples. In several passages, he says this. If I show someone the corner of a square and that person cannot find the other three, I do not show it a second time. In other words, I want people with discernment, intelligent individuals, capable of understanding the rite and applying it. People who are able to perceive the intricacies of the rite and not simply apply it blindly. I do not want fanatics. He speaks of one of his disciples, Yen, who, by the way, was a tragic figure in his life because Yen died very young. And he says that Yen was the best of his disciples. He says, I say one thing, and this man interprets 100 without error. He is able to apply it in 100 situations that I have not even mentioned. Do you see that this is a symbolic mindset? Plato says that from a situation that works, you can abstract a general law that you can apply to 100 other situations. And it works as well. He used to say, Yen, from one thing that I teach him, he abstracts 100 more, which I never mentioned. In other words, he did not want rigid people, he did not want fanatics, he wanted individuals capable of finding the other three corners of the square. Individuals capable of understanding the decrees of heaven and applying them to the present day. And just this already breaks much of the rigid view of Confucius that exists in the West. The gentleman, or the Jew man. Now he begins to speak about this man, whom he considers, not the sage, who is on a much higher level, but this man. He believes that humanity should set this as its goal, that it should strive for this. And this is what he teaches his disciples, to be gentlemen, to be Jew men. The first virtue he discusses is benevolence. This benevolence, as I mentioned to you, must be connected to discernment, it must be linked to righteousness. Because any of these virtues are lacking, it will throw the practice of benevolence out of balance. For him, do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself. Did you know that this phrase is Confucian? And later it was adapted for the West, repeated 1,001 times. Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself. Take yourself as the measure. What would not be pleasant, good, or help you grow? Do not impose that on others. This is what you should wish for, with an elevated consciousness, of course. What do I wish for myself when my consciousness is at its highest point? Do I wish to grow? Do I wish to become a noble human being? I should wish exactly that for others as well. Do not wish for others what would not help you grow, what would not bring you good, what would not make you noble. The ideal of nobility is a constant theme in Confucius thought. The practice of benevolence depends entirely on oneself and not on others. In other words, you do not need to be in any special place. You could be in a declining China, you could be in a desert. The practice of benevolence does not depend on what others think of you. In fact, he himself had no favorable conditions at all. He had no money, he did not belong to any noble family in power, he did not have the support of any prince, and yet he would say, I have never failed to practice benevolence. But he also said, look, it is difficult to find a person who is able to practice benevolence for an entire day. Just imagine an entire day without any selfishness. It is difficult to find a person like that. He said that his disciple Yen was capable of doing this, and that is why he was so rare. It is hard to find someone who can practice benevolence for an entire day. The practice of benevolence begins within the family and extends to society. Having a good child makes a good citizen. Being a good parent makes a good ruler. He said that the state is an extended family, where, for the ruler, the entire society is like his children. And the same filial love from the ruler toward the people should be reciprocated by the same paternal love from the people toward the ruler. And that this would not be difficult. He says, look, the ruler does not need to worry too much about making people esteem or obey him. It is enough to be concerned with having impeccable morals, because impeccable morals, sooner or later, will touch the hearts of people. He said that it is impossible for moral example not to soften the resistance of people. Sooner or later, it will happen. But for him, the state was a great family. And if this love does not exist in a basic nucleus, there is nowhere for it to expand from. One of his disciples, there are many beautiful stories, one of his disciples, at that time, when parents passed away, there was a mourning period of 3 years. And his disciple wanted to accompany him on his journeys around the world and did not want to observe the mourning period. He approached him and asked if he could shorten the mourning period to less than 3 years. He turned to the disciple and said, did your parents love you for less than 3 years? No. Then observe your mourning. Was it less than 3 years that they dedicated to loving you? No. Then observe your mourning. He worked deeply with the ideas of gratitude, recognition, and respect. Sung, giving the best of oneself. In what I have done for the well-being of others, have I failed to be sung? This is a phrase attributed to Yen. Every day, ask yourself, did I give my best? I went to the very limit, as a Brazilian poet says, Carlos Drummond de Andrade. Go to your heart, wrung it out, and extract out the sacred drop. They drew out the very best of their possibilities. And to go to sleep in peace, to sleep the sleep of the just. I gave my best. In what was my responsibility today, I gave my best for humanity, for my fellow human beings. Was I benevolent today? You will see that this is not the only school, you know. Pythagoras himself required this of his disciples, that they perform a self-examination before going to sleep. What we know as keeping a journal. And that they ask themselves questions, and make themselves answer, as a way to establish a meeting point with their own conscience and to evaluate their lives. This was common in these schools. So, his disciples would ask themselves, in what I did for the well-being of others, did I fail to be sung? Did I fail to give my best? Every single day. In other words, a moral standard of not bargaining with life. Always being deliverant. Your name, to be devoted, to go to the limits of your possibilities, and to die at peace with the heavens and with the earth. To have given everything you brought, not to have kept anything back. In fact, Gibran says something very beautiful, that we are not owners of anything, we are simply a station for enriching the gifts of life. Do you understand this? A station for enriching the gifts of life. Life passes through us, we give it value and send it forward. It is not ours, nothing belongs to us. This is the virtue of deliverance. This part that I mentioned to you is very beautiful when he speaks about education and formation. He begins by talking about certain virtues, which are wisdom, benevolence, and courage. A wise person is never indecisive. There are not many paths, as long as a person truly acts as a human being. If a person truly wants to be human, the path becomes clear. When a person is uncertain and desires to be something other than a human being, then many alternatives appear. For the one who seeks to become more human, their path is always clear and singular. Do you understand? It is as if you are climbing to the top of a pyramid. Are there many paths that lead to the summit? Actually, there is only one. You may come from any direction, the origins are very diverse, but the destination is the same. Just as the ultimate goal of the evolution of all plants, all animals, and all minerals, all of nature advances toward the ideal. For minerals, it is an atomic organization that grants them greater nobility. For plants, it is said to be in the direction of a dicotyledon. For animals, it is toward forms of life that are more intelligent, with greater capacity for survival and reproduction. According to the very theory of evolution, for human beings, it would be toward virtue, toward human virtue. And there is no doubt, if you want to be truly human, there is only one path. So, you see, there is no doubt. A benevolent person is never troubled. Distress always comes from holding back, from not giving what you should have given. Anguish, distress, arises from the feeling that you did not give everything you could have. That you did not practice selfless giving, that you held back, that you kept something for yourself. Selfishly, you did not let things flow, you did not allow life to flow through you. A person who gives everything does not suffer from anxiety or distress. That is the benevolent one, and the courageous person is never afraid. Airy used to say, be very careful with the courageous person. Because if the courageous person is only courageous and is not also principled, not also moral, not also benevolent, he can become a rebel, he can become cunning, he can become rude. Courage is necessary, because a person cannot grow without courage. Growth means facing the unknown, and therefore, it requires courage. Growth is a challenge toward the darkness. You do not know what lies behind the curtain. One cannot grow without a good dose of courage, but courage, if it is not allied with benevolence, if it is not allied with coherence, if it is not allied with a series of values, can produce a person who is rough, harsh, or even selfish. In other words, these virtues work well together, not in isolation. Wisdom. In fact, I mentioned this phrase to you, which is very beautiful. Know people, promote the just, and place them above the corrupt. That is what it means to be wise. Remember that Christian saying, by your works, I will know you. You recognize a wise person in this way. He knows the hearts of others deeply, because he knows his own. And whenever possible, he places wisdom above ignorance, both within and without. This creates effects where wisdom guides humanity. He speaks of ancient men, of ancient leaders who were wise. Look at who their ministers were. All were honest, all were people of integrity, all were consistent, all were good. The wise person places goodness above selfishness, integrity above corruption, both within and, consequently, outward, whenever he can influence the course of humanity. He says that a good person, whenever the opportunity arises, must commit himself to humanity. He speaks about leadership, about leaders. A good person, if there are those who wish to listen to him, has the moral obligation to speak. He cannot refrain from sharing his goodness, his discernment. If there is a state that desires a good person as its ruler, he cannot refuse to accept the role, unless there is some moral requirement. And he would have to give up his principles in order to take on the role. Otherwise, the very fact of possessing wisdom commits him to humanity. This idea that knowledge brings responsibility is also very common. Do you understand this? True knowledge generates commitment. We always illustrate this with the story of the man who knows how to swim. If you know how to swim very well, don't you have a responsibility towards someone who is drowning? Now, if you do not know how, you don't have that responsibility. If you dove in to save them, there would be 2 deaths. Knowledge always brings commitment, always creates bonds. study and education. This aspect is also very rigorous. Perhaps it could be said of me that I learn without faltering and teach without growing weary. In these two pursuits, I am tireless. For as long as I live, I would dedicate myself to them, to learning and to teaching. That fulfills me. And there is another aspect, which is also very beautiful. In a village of 10 houses, that is, a tiny little community, there will always be those who, like me, strive to do their best for others, and who remain true to their own words. But it is rare to find someone with as much desire to learn as I have. In other words, in any small group of people, you will find someone kind-hearted, and he might say, just as I am. Perhaps that's an exaggeration, right? Of course. But someone with the same eagerness to learn as I have, you will rarely find. So, my kindness becomes even more powerful, you see? When kindness is combined with inner power, it becomes increasingly capable of accomplishing what? Goodness. To promote goodness. Today, this is a serious issue. We have a prejudice against the idea of power. We believe that power corrupts. Power does not corrupt. Man is already corrupted, and power merely provides opportunities for that corruption to manifest. Do you remember that old saying I always mention to you, from Machado de Assis? He says that the saying, opportunity makes the thief, is actually wrong. Opportunity creates the crime. The thief is already made. For a person to reject power is a foolish thing, because the archetype of God is power. Can you imagine a weak God? Power is the ability to be, the ability to do, the ability to help, the ability to accomplish, the ability to build. So, when you seek out good-hearted people, make sure they also strive to enhance their goodness through knowledge. Because goodness, when combined with ignorance, cannot achieve great things. In fact, anything combined with ignorance cannot accomplish great works, whether for good or for evil. Once, I spent the whole day thinking without eating anything, and every night, thinking without going to bed, but I found that I gained nothing. With that, it would have been better to spend the time studying. He is going to say this, and it is very interesting. Do not think that it is simply a matter of thinking and reflecting, because we do not possess enough wisdom to start from nothing and arrive at great conclusions. Use the classics, the great thinkers of the past, as your starting point, as a springboard. That is where your thinking should begin. But do not think it is only a springboard. You need to think from there onward. You must add something more, which is your own reflection. Notice, neither too much to the sea, nor too much to the land. Do not just keep thinking, because you will not get anywhere. There is a professor of ours, in fact, Professor Jose Enrique, who is fond of using this example, and I just love it. He mentions Plato's concept of justice, which is to give each person what is due to them, according to their nature and their actions. Imagine if I had never read this in Plato, and had to come to this conclusion on my own, simply by observing the things in my life. Where would I get this from? Do you think I would reach this conclusion? At the club, on a Sunday, having a barbecue, would I come to this realization? Where would I draw this from? I start from what Plato said, and then I add my own reflection. Do you understand? He goes on to say, if a person learns from others but does not think, they will become confused. If a person thinks but does not learn from others, they will be in danger. In other words, a person always starts from where traditions, from where the wise people of the past, left off. He learns from the past in order to propel himself toward the future. He inherits the wisdom of the past. Because otherwise, it would be as if he woke up every day with amnesia. He would have to start his story from scratch. Now, do not think that this exempts you from thinking for yourself. You see, this is almost like a subtle irony toward intellectualism, which did not even exist yet. That is the kind of person who believes it is enough to simply know what has already been thought, without adding anything creative, without contributing anything of their own, without advancing knowledge even one trench forward. Knowledge of the past is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one. We must reflect, we must seek depth, and we must take a step forward. Humanity moves forward with you. The generations of the future will inherit this step of yours, no matter how small. Remember, he says you awaken to the path on the day you die, and even then, you have gained something. It is a single day. In other words, many people do not have even a single day in their lives that is truly human. It is sad, isn't it? But, unfortunately, it is true. There is something that concerns me. It is the inability, when I am told what is right, to actually take action. What sense does it make for me to know that something is right and not immediately take action to align myself with it? This is an incomprehensible gap to me, and it worries me. You can see how rare this was in their time. In other words, for a person to know what is right and not begin to live it from that moment on. There is a passage from a Platonic dialogue, I believe it is in The Statesman, where Socrates turns to the sophist with whom he was debating. And he says the following: "Take this seriously. This discussion matters, because it is about how I will live from tomorrow onward." I find that so beautiful. Imagine meeting someone today who says, "Explain this to me properly, because we are talking about how we'll live from tomorrow on." When do people take knowledge so seriously? From tomorrow on, I will live by this, if you can convince me. So, take this seriously. Do not run away from the discussion. This is about my life, it is about the lives of others. Knowledge was life, it was something serious. It was not simply theorizing. It is shameful to make your salary your only goal. It is not easy to find a person capable of studying for 3 years without thinking about receiving a salary. In other words, he says, study, knowledge, learning, these are the most delightful rewards a person can attain. The knowledge of the profound nature of humanity is the most exquisite feast a person can savor. If someone seeks this only in pursuit of a government position, which at that time was common, if one wanted a job as a public servant in some state, if he seeks it with the intention of standing out, then that knowledge has no value. And he says, it is rare for someone to seek knowledge for its own sake, without desiring anything else. Nothing beyond knowledge itself. Notice how relevant this is today, everyone. Imagine if you approached someone and said, you can get a college degree without having to study. 4 or 5 years, guaranteed. I will give it to you. There is no risk at all. Or I could get you a job in a public institution without you having to pass the entrance exam, and it is guaranteed, there's no risk. How many would hesitate out of fear? Some of them perhaps, but out of moral commitment, out of a sense of conscience, how many would truly refuse? Knowledge becomes a burden that stands in the way of what you really want, which is the reward. Who truly loves knowledge for its own sake? Who delights in learning as if it were the most exquisite of feasts? Self-knowledge, understanding the mystery of life every single day. He says, this is what is most truly mine, a deep love for learning. The knight feels ashamed when his words are more ambitious than his actions. This is the knight's sense of modesty. He speaks slowly and acts as swiftly as he can. His words never outpace his actions. That would be a form of lack of modesty. And the lack of modesty, according to these traditions, Plato also speaks about this. It is serious. When a person makes a mistake and feels ashamed, that is a positive thing. That is a sign of modesty. When someone makes a mistake and no longer feels any shame, it is a sign that this society has lost its moral standard. Do you understand? When someone puts their mistakes on display and no longer feels any sense of modesty, that is a sign of serious moral decline. A true knight possesses great modesty. And one thing he is especially modest about is making sure his words are never grander than his life. Never. Always, life comes first, and only then come the words. To love benevolence without loving learning can lead to foolishness. You see, this is not an idea of a sentimental or superficial benevolence. Rather, it is about knowing what to give to people so that they may grow. And also knowing when not to give anything at all. You know that saying, that popular proverb which goes, necessity is the mother of innovation? Sometimes, a person is going through a difficult situation, which life has pushed them up to it so that they might respond, and then you step in and interrupt the action of karma, as it is often said. You end up supporting that person's weakness out of a supposed sense of pity. I don't know if any of you have ever seen someone go through this. In general, when you step in and take on someone else's karma, and then, when you realize your mistake and stop doing it, that person is not grateful. They believe you were only doing what you were supposed to do by supporting them. Have you ever noticed that? You did not allow nature to do its work. That is not benevolence. That is demagoguery. To know how to help. To know how to be benevolent. Benevolence cannot be devoid of intelligence, because otherwise it becomes foolishness. To know how to help people is to help them grow, not simply to do what pleases them. That is manipulation and demagoguery. And now he will speak a little about government as we come to a close, since our time is ending. About how to govern the people. Guide them through virtue, keep them in line with rituals, that is, the sacralization of life. Life as a way to channel heaven and earth, to unite heaven and earth. And the people, in addition to being able to feel shame, will reform themselves. Now, if you apply sanctions, they will act only as long as they are forced to. When the sanctions end, they will do whatever they please. He speaks clearly about the ineffectiveness of sanctions. Unite the people, and they will act properly as long as the sanctions are in place. When they end, they will return to their old ways. Now, set an example. And you will see that they will feel ashamed of their shortcomings and will correct themselves. Look at how beautiful this next phrase is. The virtue of the noble person is like the wind. The virtue of the common person is like the grass. When the wind blows over the grass, it will surely bend. In other words, when the virtue of the perfect noble, the Jew man, blows, ignorance bows because it recognizes wisdom. And it feels ashamed of being so small. Contrast generates awareness. It begins to awaken within people. A reference point, a desire to become better. He says, in one way or another, that people imitate their leaders. Whether they are aware of it or not, people imitate their leaders. They aspire to be like them. And people know who their leaders are. They recognize and know how to identify the guidance of a virtuous father. And they always imitate their leaders. Sooner or later, a virtuous leader will inspire the people to become virtuous, just as the grass bends to the wind. A small historical curiosity. I mentioned to you earlier about when Confucianism arrived in the West. It was brought by the Jesuits, led by the mission of Father Ricci, in the 17th century, in 1687. When the Jesuits arrived to begin the process of converting people to Christianity in China, they encountered Confucianism. They concluded that it was not a religion, but rather a moral code, one that, in fact, the West itself was in need of. And they brought it back. It was translated into Latin in Paris in 1687. They regarded it as a system of practical philosophy, not a religion. Which is, in fact, what it truly is. Confucianism was born to be a philosophy of life. And now, the last quote I brought for you, which I find very beautiful. It is a synthesis that Confucius presents in the Analects about how he managed his own life. At 15, I devoted myself wholeheartedly to learning. At 30, I established my position. At 40, I freed myself from doubts. At 50, I understood the mandate of heaven. At 60, my ears were attuned. At 70, I followed my heart without overstepping the boundaries. In other words, at 70, I could do whatever I wished because what I wanted and what I ought to do had become one and the same. So I could follow my heart, which would never go beyond the proper boundaries. Because I had educated my heart to be in harmony with the decrees of heaven. Do you understand? This is a person who has been shaped, attuned, and refined in accordance with the laws of the universe throughout his life. Since the age of 15, he sought to learn what it means to be human. Because, as he says, the great work of a person is to build oneself morally, to truly become human. Well, as I mentioned to you, this is just a brief overview. Anyone who doesn't know this little book has no idea what they're missing. I know everyone must be overwhelmed by the number of bedside books I have recommended to you. Please forgive me. Here comes one more. Because you simply cannot miss the Analects. It is wonderful. This translation by LPM is excellent. I highly recommend it. And, without a doubt, it deserves a place as another bedside book. Of course, next week I will recommend another one. But let's just pretend it is only this one for now. It's truly worth it. A real marvel. An unmissable classic. It would be wonderful